Okay, now, I saw that thread that Hayoko put out, and I saw this video that my friend put up, so I feel like it's only best if I do this, because, parody and all that, but, Hayoko was straight up just lying, man. I'm still disappointed in myself for, falling for his trick one time, and, just falling for it over and over again is just kind of embarrassing at this point, but this dude is not a good owner. I still feel ashamed of myself for being able to be manipulated into the position that this dude who does literally nothing for the game and gets a paycheck has ownership of the game over, Saul, who arguably has more of a place to own the game, if anything, because he did like fucking 80% of the game shit. No matter what anybody wants to say, I'm just gonna like say it up front right here. That dude worked his ass off for the fucking game, and it only got taken away from him because of people who were around him. That's the only reason that it was fucking gone, and that's the only reason that it was even going to be sold in the first place, was because people were telling him to. And this dude in his thread, because he's getting sued by Soul or whatever, this dude is saying, Forsaken is just as important to y'all, if not more, as it is to us. Now, I know this dude is lying, because I have never heard of this dude doing anything positive for the dev team whatsoever. I've only heard of this dude completely like ignoring the team and only doing things when it like benefited him. And he's crunched the team so hella hard that the only time that anything ever got done is the moment that Aaron got put in charge of being the fucking director of the entire goddamn game, because he wasn't fit for it. He wasn't fit for it. And he still makes money off of a position that he does nothing for. He's just an advisor at that point. And it's kind of embarrassing. This whole thing is embarrassing. The fact that I had to go through all of this, the fact that he had the position to make all of these things easier for himself. He had the ability to go ahead and go out and, dispel all these rumors and lies and shit about Soul, like all these people saying that he's like a pedophile, that he's a Nazi, that he's a groomer, that he's all this, that he's all that. No, he's not. You know what happened? He was 13. And there was somebody going around sharing news of him when he was 12 to places that his groomer could see, and he wanted control. And he's never groomed anyone, and he's not a Nazi. There was this whole ass 1X thing that the person who made the image had to admit that they scapegoated Soul for it. And it's just like, there was this whole ass doc that Soul put out answering to everything that was actually truthful and everything that, that he didn't do and everything that he did do. And, the reasonings behind what he did and, the reasonings behind what he didn't, And Hayoko had every ability to make that doc well known. But instead of making the doc that would have cleared up, Soul's name, that would have made dealing with Forsaken a lot more easy, he decided to just completely ignore it. When the first things of the NDA started coming out or whatever, he started talking about how this was like all, Soul's fault or whatever. He willingly signed that contract. He willingly signed the contract that said that he had to remain in contact with Soul and that he had to pay Soul. That's what he willingly agreed to. That's what we all agreed to. Well, relatively. I didn't know what actually went down. I was never there involved for like any of the actual deals. I was involved in like the before the whole thing went down. But regardless, I still know the details of it because I was either shown it by Hayoko or I was told about it when we were discussing it all together. But realistically, he willingly signed onto this contract for this game that he basically took over back then when the game was at risk of being sold or whatever. He took over it illegally, and he basically felt like he had a right to ownership or whatever. Whenever Ava and Soul were taking a break, they put him in charge of everything. He felt like he needed, he was like the de facto owner because of that. But no, he's a PR dude. He's a PR manager. His entire job is to lie and manipulate people. That's his entire job. But he willingly signed onto this contract where he had to stay in contact with Soul and pay him. We discussed everything. It was all discussed. It was all discussed beforehand. He says all this shit about how we wanted a better deal. No, we all discussed and you agreed. You agreed, Hayoko. I remember specifically that you agreed that Soul needs some sort of payment. Like, regardless, because this was his game. This was his game. Like, people want to say that, Balls, made the game. Like, sure, he may have made the game, but he didn't make it. He didn't raise it. That was kind of what everybody else did, because Balls was, relatively, absent from the game's development way back. And a lot of people can like agree with this. Like, a lot of people can like back it up, and it's just, you can't even be shocked anymore. You can't even be shocked anymore with how much this dude does just lie. Like, I'm gonna be completely honest. I keep on seeing every single day, and I'm being completely honest. I'm saying this as somebody who was like completely and utterly broken by Soul, who was like hurt by him to extreme mental turmoil. I still, I have no bad blood with him now. We made up, we talked, he apologized. There was a lot of issues behind what happened that, don't need to become public. That didn't need to become public. And that's what happens with every single other issue he's been in. That's what's happened with every single issue he's been in. That there's always been issues and problems behind the scenes that he and anybody else can't talk about it, because it shouldn't be talked about, because it should be private. Because all of this wouldn't have to be, handled if people stopped putting their noses where it didn't belong. Like, there was this whole thing back then where they started calling this one person called Unpalilua a victim. And, I looked into it. I looked like as heavily into it as I could. And the only things that there was that this dude Unpalilua was called out for being into, basically little kids. They were unironically like into like all of these things, and they were called out about it like several times over, whether it be in like private or like public. And regardless of that, the dudes behind the Soul Driven Liar Fuwadi account or whatever, who I really quickly want to say, they harassed me en masse for saying this, but Unpalilua, they still they engaged in these activities, but Fuwadi Productions decided to drag out this idea that they were some sort of victim in some sort of way when they weren't. At most, it was, Soul's friends making fun of him, poking fun at him, That's all that happened. That's all that happened with that dude. And then they started claiming this whole thing of, oh, Soul unbanned this predator, when no, that was somebody else. They claimed this thing of, the whole daring porn of minors, which of course I've already explained to you what it was before. It was a fucking 13-year-old Soul having his 12-year-old nudes, not his 12-year-old, when he was 12. He had his nudes being shared around in places, especially where like his groomer could see it. And obviously, the fucking groomed, traumatized kid is of course gonna have like some sort of like extreme reaction to that, They're gonna want some sort of control. They're gonna like at least want to feel like they have some sort of control in their life after being robbed of it after so many goddamn times over, And this isn't even going into the stuff with, how many times he's been swatted, how many times he's had his, computer taken away and searched. Even him going into the police station and trying to turn himself in, which I've heard that he's done. And, he did that and he got turned away. And, you'd think that if he was like a pedophile or anything, he would be like arrested. He would be like, held accountable and charged for all of these, disgusting things he's done. But he hasn't done any of them. He hasn't done any of them. He's been, searched for all of this. He's been looked at over this because, obviously the amount of people, putting in calls, saying, oh, this person did this, you should really take a look. They're going to take a look. They've taken a look at him like twice now. They've swatted his family several times over. He's tried to turn himself in. There was nothing. There was nothing. All this was only built upon lies just because these people hated Soul with like all of their guts for whatever goddamn reason. And I'm not saying he's not done like anything bad. Like, of course he has. He's admitted to it. He's admitted that he's done some bad things like as a child that, he's admitted that were wrong, no matter the context behind it. He's admitted that there were issues that happened that led to all of these, disgusting acts that he did, whether or not he actually meant it, with his like weird distilled sense of what was right and what was wrong, He still did bad things, of course, but there was reasons. And it doesn't mean that any of these things that people are calling him are true, Especially if he wasn't arrested for them. And it's so infuriating. I have, I don't have to deal with this. It's not something I have to deal with it, but it's so frustrating. All of this is so frustrating. Like, I don't know, man. At this point, Hayoko isn't a good person. You shouldn't be rooting for Hayoko here. I honestly would rather Soul win this entire thing, because I've seen, leagues of improvement that, of course, anybody in the public wouldn't see. But I've seen leagues of improvement, like way back, even back before all this, Forsaken shit, like as far back as 2022. Like I always saw this like sort of improvement in him, but Hayoko still to this day, he still lies. He still like, he still goes on and on and on about these fake promises. These just lying to everybody's face and expecting everybody to praise him. And it's disgusting. But I'm just tired of this dude, man. I'm tired of this dude. He's had every single, option to make everything easier for himself. He has every single availability to, make it known that, Soul isn't any of the awful shit that people are calling himself. I've even, opened up that avenue for him by, being a victim and, speaking up about my experience, but also being open about, the harassment and, just invalidity of a lot of the claims that the dudes behind the Soul Driven Liar and Wadi Productions did. He's had all of these options and he's never taken any of them. He's always painted Soul out to be the villain. He's always tried to put on this hero act when he's not a hero. He's not a hero. He's trying to play hero. But yeah, regardless, that's all relatively I wanted to get out and say, because I'm frustrated and I'm tired with all this.